Welcome to Public Policy Show. Today is our last episode from Harvard Business School. I would like to thank Caroline Kurdej for directing our show while at the business school. Today we're going to be joined by Michael Berne, who is an expert in real estate development, and we'll be asking him questions about how small businesses are struggling in local communities. Right, and when it comes to Harvard Square, there used to be like smaller businesses that were in the area. Now some of the businesses are forced out by large developers like Asana Partners. Like there's a small shop, for example, Black Ink, and they
Yeah,
need to leave the area because of high rent. So,
yeah.
what are some of the ways to save these small businesses?
Well, to some degree, this is a function of growth. And, a lot of what's happening is you have property values rising to such levels that the purchase price demands, rents that existing businesses, small businesses often cannot sustain. Now, there's a lot of theories as to why landlords will remove those small businesses and then seemingly leave their spaces vacant for years on end.
Right.
What I will say is there are a lot of reasons why they could be doing that. For instance,
Right.
If you buy a property and you're paying a lot for it, and you're getting a mortgage for it, just like we all do when we buy a house, the terms of the mortgages that you get might require rents to stay at a certain minimum threshold. They can't be dropped below that threshold, or else the value of the asset declines. So that kind of puts some of these landlords in a pickle. Because for a variety of reasons, they might be overshooting the market. Whether it's because, retailers simply aren't expanding to the same degree. They're really buying into this narrative of retail apocalypse. And so it becomes really difficult for landlords and tenants to kind of meet on a rental number that they can both be happy with.
And some of the communities are trying to regulate tenant mix, right? They
Yes.
would have. So how do they do that?
Well, there's a number of ways you could do that. Now, I'm not saying that I would recommend any of them. That's another discussion. But some of the ideas that are being bandied about, commercial rent control. New York City is wrestling with something like that right now. Formula retail ordinances. Perhaps the city most closely associated with this is San Francisco. They've had a formula retail ordinance since 2004. Commercial vacancy taxes, which have already been applied actually in the region, as you probably know, in Arlington. And legacy business ordinances, which provide support for businesses that have been around for a certain number of years. There are also other policy interventions that have been utilized in the past, retail quotas, for instance. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. I get nervous when we talk about these sorts of interventions. While real estate might seem relatively simple, it's not. And I think we're courting danger if we try to intervene in an ecosystem that we don't fully understand. You'll often get all sorts of unintended consequences. And I think another piece of that to keep in mind is that, this is what's underlying this desire to kind of freeze a certain moment in time for Harvard Square or any other district, right? And to kind of keep it a certain way. And oftentimes the interventions that you might consider in order to do that can have the effect of keeping us from what's the next iteration, what's the next cool retail concept or format. And that's a process that's as scary, that's an organic process that, as scary as it might be, is ultimately a healthy one. And so I think that's not something you want to mess with. Finally, I would point out, it used to be you could rather clearly understand what's a chain and what's a mom and pop. That's no longer binary. In fact, it's become very murky, because what you're finding is small has been successful now to the point where they're becoming big, and big is trying to actually look small. And so, you might think you are talking about one or the other, chain versus mom and pop, and you're not. You might be talking about, again, small that's been big, or big trying to look small. And, so anyway, my point is that I get nervous about interventions. Some of them I do think can have positive impact, but I approach them carefully and humbly, knowing that the market is a beast, and one that we don't always entirely understand. So.
Yeah. Smaller businesses, usually when they enter communities, they tend to stay longer, and then the traction, especially among students, is high, and the students come out and actually shop in the area when small businesses are there, because they're just more innovative and they have newer products. But larger businesses, like we have Bank of America or CVS or Staples, like huge conglomerates, like it's not exciting for people to come out and just to shop at those places as much as it is for smaller businesses. And then we had a guest actually from Arizona. He represents Arizona Local First, and what they've done is they only accept like donations for their organization if you're a small business, and they don't take funds from publicly traded companies because publicly traded companies tend to be larger, of course, and they're the ones who go into communities, and most of the time they use these monopolistic market practices, which is abuse of power and dominance, and so that's what they're trying to avert. And Phoenix, as you might know, has been successful in that. So what do you think about that approach to make sure that publicly traded companies, large ones especially, are not as welcome as small businesses in an area?
Well, again, I think it's a tricky one. Two things I'll say is, we're often not considering the full trade-offs of what we are aspiring to. So, for instance, in San Francisco, they've done a lot of research on this connected to the Formula Retail Ordinance, and have found, amazingly, that while, yes, small businesses do recycle more money into the community, that actually that money is more than outweighed by the fact that they tend to be a lot more expensive, right? So on the net, actually, one could make the argument that, yes, you might be getting more money recycled through the community, but you're giving away more money to a small business because they tend to be more expensive. And when you're talking about students, I don't think that's insignificant. Another point I would mention is that even I found in my consulting work, and I work, in communities across the U.S., including many university towns, Boulder, New Haven, University City, and Philadelphia.
Right.
I have found that even the most virulently anti-chain communities, they would die for a Trader Joe's, right? Some of them, not all of them, some of them would die for a small format Target. And my point in all this is really to say that a lot of this is marketing more than anything else. And because there are many exceptions that, again, even the most virulently anti-chainers will make.
Right.
And if I look at universities, university towns, I'm not sure that I see students necessarily preferring small businesses. I do think that the people who are drawn to living in university towns, older, well-educated, tend to prefer small businesses. The final point I'll make on this is that, I think there's also the question of, are we walking the walk? And what do I mean by that? Well, not only the Trader Joe's example, but also, there's a favorite New Yorker cartoon which shows a local bookstore on the ground floor, and you have the owner of that local bookstore saying hello to the neighbor who lives upstairs. And the neighbor is saying hello back, and the neighbor's very happy that his local bookstore is there. And then what you also see is that neighbor, while waving, is also accepting a package from Amazon. Right? And I think we let ourselves off the hook way too easily.
Right.
The change is us, right? And so, I think that's another important point in all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting that you made the fact that, in San Francisco, when you mentioned that small businesses, they're thriving, but it's costing more. But at the same time, small businesses are the ones who are paying taxes. And the more small businesses we have, the more revenue we get, because we know that large conglomerates, including Amazon, you just mentioned, not only they don't pay any taxes, they get subsidies from government, from the state government, the federal government, and companies like GE, even General Electric, haven't paid taxes in years, which is shocking. And at the end of the day, it comes down to this. I mean, we live in a capitalist democracy. The only benefit of capitalism is to start a business so that communities thrive. And at some point in life, people need to start a business. I mean, that's the only benefit of it. Otherwise, what was the difference between communism? In communism, we had 100% employment, but you had this large monopoly, and it wasn't exciting to work there because you had no identity, you made no difference in the community. So that's the whole benefit, in my opinion, of small business, because you have a goal. You're creating something new for a society, something innovative.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're really getting at is barriers to entry.
Yeah.
And that it increasingly feels like we don't have choices.
Right.
Or if we, and we have to deal with certain very large, baseless, and seemingly unreachable entities for everything, right? Whether it's the phone company, whether it's the public utility, whether it's the government, whether it's, a retailer with no level of customer service. And it's frustrating. And I think that's why the last 10, 15 years we have seen a real pushback in the form of a rising demand for artisanal, for craft, for for just more generally for something on a smaller human scale.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it also comes down to, at the end of the day, it's a market economy that we operate in, and we do have investors who invest in the stock market. So maybe we should start thinking about developing smaller index funds, so that which would be composed with smaller entities. Because first of all, the reward is higher because it's riskier, and second of all, societies benefit with that. So that may be another approach. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I can't help but see the nuances of it. I mean, I didn't really address your early question about publicly traded companies.
Right.
And I mean, I would agree. Publicly traded companies, there is certainly a focus on the shareholder, an exclusive focus on the shareholder. That's not always good for retail. because it really does kind of lead to a lot of short-term thinking. What's going to raise the stock price at the next, for the next quarter, and not the sort of longer-term investments that, especially today, retailers need to be making. Now that said, I hesitate to demonize publicly traded companies because, yes, there are big investors. There are also, there's also pensions. There's also life insurance policies. Those are, so it's. I don't think it's as clear cut as a 1%, 99% sort of binary.
No, absolutely. And then I'm just thinking like maybe ways of bringing those investors into like smaller index funds so that smaller businesses benefit.
Yeah.
So that, yes, there's money out there. It needs to be invested. They need to make, money off of it. But what I'm saying is maybe smaller index funds that can actually benefit smaller companies may be allowed to trade on the stock exchange.
Yeah, and I think, it's part of a whole package of lowering barriers to entry.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And I think in as much as retail is concerned, and we came up against this in Boulder, Pearl Street Mall in downtown Boulder, incredibly successful, certainly from a occupancy point of view. Its occupancy was at the time like 1 to 2, vacancy was at the time like 1 to 2%. And rents were high. And the feeling was that rents are too high. And my response was that, well, they're not too high for everyone. They might be too high for the kinds of tenants that you want, but they're not too high for everyone. And rather than saying we're going to try to tamp down that market somehow, we're going to try to intervene in what landlords are charging or who they could lease to. How about saying, well, what about on either side of that core, where the rents are a little more forgiving, right? And what you end up doing is you end up expanding the downtown because you're making use of the lower rent periphery as kind of that new incubator for smaller businesses. Look at this writ large. Where would Brooklyn of today be without Manhattan? Where would Oakland be without San Francisco? Right? These stories of reemergence, they've largely been driven by a core that's just too expensive, and so there's spillover, and that can be a healthy process. It can be a very painful process on an individual basis, right? If you're the business that's displaced, but overall, it's actually re-energized larger and larger parts of their respective metropolitan areas, which is probably a good thing. So I don't know. It's I always try to think, okay, you might be trying to push a boulder uphill by saying we're going to hold back what seems to be coming our way in the core. Maybe the easier and more successful tact is to say, okay, what's the second tier street where we can concentrate these small businesses and where they might be better able to sustain the rents? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolutely a good sense. It's just on that second tier street, what happens when Bank of America decides to go in and take over the entire corner? There has to be a mechanism for them to sustain themselves on the second street, but it's a great way for them to expand. What's the difference between like investing in urban or versus like rural areas, like from your experience?
Well, I actually think that e-commerce, certainly its impact has been somewhat misunderstood, but what I've long thought is actually the retail that's been most vulnerable to e-commerce is not in our downtowns and our urban neighborhoods. It's been the big box centers, because if you think about all those category killers that emerged in the 90s, right? And they each specialized in a particular type of merchandise, and they offered enormous selection all in one place. They were trading on selection and convenience, right? Well, who does selection and convenience better than the internet?
Right.
Right? So a lot of the high profile liquidations we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, Circuit City, Sports Authority, Toys R Us, Linens and Things, all of these were category killers, right? And so it was those big box centers which really took hit, because really after selection and convenience, what else did they have to go on?
Right.
Whereas downtowns, urban neighborhoods, they've been working on a formula ever since they hit their low point 50 or so years ago, right? And they've seemed to have hit on the formula of, driven by food and beverage, with focus on placemaking, historic architecture, everything that was really set in motion with James Rouse and the festival marketplace of the 70s. So they've had a head start at figuring this out. It's these big box centers that really don't have any other reason for being that have really, really been hurt by this. So, I actually think that's where a lot of the damage has been done. What I think is interesting is that as some of these categories, as they've been pretty much taken over by e-commerce, and ultimately led to the demise of some of these category killer chains, there's now a vacuum. There's still demand for bookstores. There's just, we no longer have borders. We only have maybe half the Barnes and Nobles we used to have. So since 2010, number of independent booksellers has gone up every year. And so I think what's happened is e-commerce's impact has actually kind of led us in perhaps different directions than we would have anticipated, and created opportunities, in our downtowns and urban neighborhoods for some of these types of retail, like the independent bookstore, that we thought we lost.
Right. What are some of these small business policies that you've seen, like, that are friendlier to small businesses? Let's say if a community wants to develop a small business area. I know Burlington, Vermont has been successful in that.
Yeah.
What's their secret?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if Ron was going to join us on the call today, but I think there are a number of proactive strategies that communities can undertake to support small businesses. In terms of new small businesses, when you think about an entrepreneur, might have a great idea and might be very talented, but just might not have the capital to get started.
Right.
And in a lot of situations, the landlord is not about to provide much help when they're not even sure that this entrepreneur will be able to last. Right? Why should a landlord invest in the build out of the space for a tenant that might not be around in a year, right? So that's somewhere where governments or business improvement districts can step in with forgivable loan funds to help with tenant build out, especially with food and beverage. The first time restaurateur does not have the money, almost never have the money to build out a kitchen, because kitchens are very expensive, right? And that's something which, where the public nonprofit sector could potentially step in. I'm not a big fan of operating support like rent subsidies, but in terms of help with build out, that's something different, because presumably that investment accrues to the space and not just that one individual tenant. So that that's one thing that's been done. Another piece is different forms of technical assistance. It's amazing the difference it could make when a business changes the way it presents itself to the world, right?
Right.
And that can be done rather inexpensively. Whether you're talking facades or signage, but also window displays, in-store layout, things of that nature. For merchants that are willing to listen, and that's not all of them.
Right.
There are some nuggets which they could take from that, which could really help their business. And that's also in addition to the facade improvement dollars that are pretty standard these days as a tool to help small businesses. I could kind of keep going forever, but
this is excellent. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, so those are. Also, I'm always amazed at how many communities I work in, how many main streets where there's a collection of merchants, but they barely have anything to do with each other. There's just not a community of merchants who are helping each other out, or referring customers to each other, or getting together for the purposes of advocacy, and so that's a simple one too, to kind of almost introduce merchants to each other. I'm always amazed at how frequently I see that. So that's, and again, that's not an expensive fix at all. And finally, another piece which I think really helps small businesses also is just the way an entire district is marketed to the general public. I think we underestimate the importance of that. Kind of developing a retail brand for the district as a whole, and getting the word out in all the ways that we need to do it these days, whether it's social media, whether it's guerrilla marketing, right? And really to get and keep the district top of mind, right? To use marketing speak. I think that's an important piece of it too.
Well, thank you, Michael, so much for joining us today and for sharing your experience.
Yes.
We wish you good luck, and again, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Again, this was our last episode from Harvard Business School, and we'll see you in December from Washington.